Okay, everybody, so in the previous video, I talked about the three Muslim gunpowder empires of the Middle East and India, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire. Um, and talked about what's going on in Africa religiously and politically with the expansion of Islam south of the Sahara Desert, following the trade routes and the growth of these kingdoms, really since the Middle Ages, and then especially in the early modern period. First Mali and Ghana, and then for our period, Songhai and Kanem Bornu being the most important ones, and how those kingdoms were built on a combination of the gold trade, on the one hand, the bands of mounted warriors on horseback, right, sort of access to horses and the growth of a military force in that sense, and then Islam, which brought literacy and diplomatic and trade connections to the Muslim world. So all these things tying together to lead to the rise of these inland Muslim kingdoms. And I mentioned down along the coast, you've got trade ports starting to emerge, partly trading with the interior people where the gold is, and partly trading with the Europeans, who since the 1400s have started working their way down the western Atlantic coast of Africa, and they're coming down there looking for trade and expansion. Europeans are not so much really conquering Africa at this point. They're tending to seize islands offshore and establish bases and ports there and fortresses, and sometimes sort of coastal forts they'll set up, around the mouth of a river, but they're not really conquering Africa at this point. The Europeans, starting with the Portuguese and then other European traders and merchants and kingdoms, start sort of following in the Portuguese's footsteps. The Dutch, the English, the French start coming down there as well eventually. Initially, what they're looking for is trade, and what they're particularly, thinking of is gold. You may remember I mentioned in the prior video that Western Africa, the inland of Western Africa, is one of the world's major sources of gold, and the Europeans knew this in the Middle Ages. They knew where the gold came from, and they were looking for a way to get at it, much of the way that Columbus was trying to find a way to get at, more directly, the spice trade of East Asia. The Portuguese are going down, trying to find a more direct way to get to the gold trade of Africa, and, sort of making friends or, forcing friendship sometimes on the sort of African leaders of the coastline in order to get a finger on the gold trade and find ways to, bypass Muslim middlemen. They find another product which they can make a profit on as they start dealing with West Africans, and that's slaves. And slavery is something we ought to take a moment to talk about and go back, talk about the older history of it. Slavery had been quite common in the ancient world, common in ancient Greece, very common in ancient Rome. You had very large populations of slaves in those areas, and nobody in the West, here we're talking basically Europe, nobody had ever abolished slavery. The Muslim world continues practicing slavery all through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. And in Europe also, slavery is never abolished. Nobody ever sets out to free all the slaves or end slavery in Europe through the Middle Ages. But a couple of things happen in Europe that change the way slavery works, or servitude works, as you'll see the way it evolves. One is that even during the Roman Empire, slave owners notice that people don't like being slaves. Slaves tend to revolt or try to murder their masters if they get unhappy enough, or run away much more, commonly. And so you start thinking about, okay, you can have guards and chains and lock them all up and do that kind of thing, but that, doesn't seem to make them any happier when you do those things. And Roman slave owners had realized that if you take your slaves and instead of running them around in chain gangs with whips and guards and dogs, if instead you take a slave and you let Mr. Slave get married to Mrs. Slave and start a family and give them a patch of land on your estate where they could have some farmland of their own, a little cottage of their own, and they could live there and support themselves, but then they also have to give you all the surplus produce that they grow. Then those slaves tend to be a lot happier, a lot less likely to try to murder you or try to run away, right? You sort of, allow them to have something they can think of as their own, and now you've got a more secure, profitable situation where you don't have to be spending all the money on the chains and the dogs and the guards. So economically, by the time you're getting to the late Roman Empire, say the 300s and 400s, Roman slaves are looking a lot less like old-fashioned chain gang slaves, from a couple of centuries earlier. Okay, so the nature of slavery is changing economically. The other thing is that Christianity spreads in the Roman Empire and then in medieval Europe afterwards, and Christianity does not actually abolish slavery, never actually calls for that until much later, which we'll actually talk about abolition movements later on. But it does change the way that people think about slavery and changes some of the conditions that slaves live under. Christianity affirms that slaves are human beings, whereas old Greco-Roman ideology tended to say the slave is a talking tool or a living dead man, no longer legally counting as a human being. Christianity says, no, they are human beings. They actually have to be recognized as such. They can convert, they can get saved, they will be in heaven someday alongside their masters, and they will not be slaves when they get to heaven. They can be baptized, and therefore other things like marriage also apply to slaves, which again reinforces the tendency, you can no longer treat your slaves as animals that you're going to, breed or sell them off separately from their families or things like that. Christian ethics say you got to treat a marriage among slaves as a real marriage where the family stays together and all the rest of it. And the slaves themselves have to abide by Christian ethics. So that kind of changes the way people think about slavery. Also, Christianity looks pretty darkly on the idea of selling Christians as slaves to non-Christians, right? It discourages exporting slaves and discourages people from taking free people who are Christians and reducing them into slavery. You're not supposed to do that. And that kind of discourages a lot of sort of enslavement. As more and more of the population gets to be slaves, you're less and less likely to put people into slavery as it goes on. As the Middle Ages go on and Christianity is slowly spreading across Europe, this leads to kind of an interesting shift in the language. The old Latin word for slave was a servus, which is where we get words like servant from. The old Latin servi, old Latin slaves, are turning into serfs, right? Servus, serf. You can see the word shifts. A serf in medieval Europe being a person who is not free. They still have a master. They still have very heavy obligations. Particularly the medieval serf is bound to the land, meaning they can't leave or go or take a job someplace else. They have to legally remain on their master's land and work their master's land and hand it over. They can't leave without their master's permission. But it's not quite slavery, right? They're not quite human property. They're a step up from that. Not very far up from that. Like I say, not free. This is not freedom. But they're not complete, outright, property the way your dog or your horse might be your property either, right? You have obligations towards them too. So the old Roman servi are turning into medieval serfs, and in the meantime, for a while, you've still got pagans in Europe who are living out in Eastern Europe, where they are of the Slavic ethnicity, right? Poles and Magyars, and, well, not Magyars, they're not Slavs, but, non-Christian Slavic peoples living in the east of Europe. And for a while, when you have warfare between Christian Western Europe and Slavic Eastern Europe, not that those are united, but separate kingdoms in each. If you take some Slavic prisoners, you will sell them into slavery, and so all the European languages stop using the old Latin word for slave, and they start using the ethnic word Slav to be the base for their word for slaves, like slave in English, sklavin in German, and esclavage you get in French, and all these sort of related kinds of words. Eventually the Slavs themselves convert to Christianity by the year 1000 or so, and then you really see slavery kind of trail off in Europe. Never disappears completely, but you just don't have a lot of slaves around. There's a lot of serfs, but there's not a lot of slaves, not a lot of people who are outright human property. The Portuguese exploration of the Atlantic and moving down into Africa starts to change that. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a new population of non-Christians eligible for enslavement down there, and the Portuguese start, taking Africans and bringing them into slavery for themselves. They're using them, there's a couple of ways. You don't get large numbers going to Europe itself. Back in Europe, you might have some that would sort of be household servants and that kind of thing, but, not major numbers. But what you are getting is, say, in, like, islands off the coast of Africa, the Portuguese will set up plantations. This was something that the Italians had begun to do in the Mediterranean Sea during the Middle Ages, setting up plantation economies. The marks of a plantation, one, is that you have a cash crop. You're not growing a variety of crops for food and for the necessities of life. You're growing one single cash crop for the market to go sell and make a profit on, and then to maximize your profit, you use slave labor. So cash crop plus slave labor makes a plantation. So the Portuguese are sort of expanding this system. They're taking over the Canaries and the Azores and islands like that, and they're setting up plantations on them. They're getting slaves from Africa to run these plantations. With the Spanish conquests in the New World, what happens is that European diseases and violence, the kind of thing that De las Casas was talking about in our readings from last week, depopulates the Americas. European diseases like smallpox kill off something like 90% of the Native American population, and as the Spanish find their conquered population dying under their noses and sort of disappearing on them, they want to get plantations going and mining going and things like that in the Americas. They don't have Americans, Native Americans, to do it, so they start bringing slaves over from Africa too, and the plantation system starts working in there. So you get widespread plantations, places like Cuba and Haiti and San Juan and, all these kinds of places, Puerto Rico, Barbados, we got all these mostly sugar and indigo plantations. Cotton's going to come later. All around the Caribbean Sea and in Portuguese Brazil and, in the American mainland as well. So the plantation economy comes across with all this, and what you're going to do is bring in African slaves to work the plantations. How are you getting them, right? Where are the slaves coming from? And this is something which is often exaggerated or distorted on either side. If you watch the old show Roots from the 1970s, you get the sort of image of Europeans kind of hiding in the bushes and, African boys going by, and the Europeans kind of jump out of the bushes with nets and catch them and drag them off to a ship. That almost never happened. Europeans generally were not going around hunting down Africans to enslave themselves, because they largely didn't have to. You could go into a port town or a village in Africa and buy slaves. From the Africans themselves. The Africans played a role in the enslavement of other Africans. And what was going on here is that it was part of African society, as with a lot of pre-modern societies, that when you fought a war against somebody and raided their villages or conquered them, you would take their people as slaves, or some of their people. Anyway, this was a routine part of African warfare, sort of enslaving each other as they fought their wars back and forth with each other. And in African society, when someone became your slave, the African sensibility, this is the other way to distort it, actually. Let me explain this. So one way of distorting it would be to imagine it's very one-sided. It's Europeans kind of going to Africa and hunting slaves there, which is not really what was happening. It was not exclusively Europeans. The distortion you sometimes hear on the other side is sort of it's all the Africans' fault. The Africans are capturing all the slaves, and the Africans are just, sort of selling themselves into slavery in this way. And that also can kind of distort it a little bit, because what you need to take into account is that the African cultures had a slightly different sensibility about who these people were that were enslaved, and what it was. The way an African thought about it, slaves generally belonged to a king. He was the one who led the armies and was responsible for the conquests and the wars that led to people getting enslaved. And what the king owned technically was not exactly the person. It's not that the person was reduced to a piece of property, but rather the king owned the person's labor. That is to say, the king could claim labor services from a captive and not have to pay them for it, obviously. Now, that would carry implications, such as that, the person couldn't be free to go do whatever job they wanted or, travel where they wanted because they had to be there giving their labor to the king. But it was a slightly different sensibility from the old, Roman sensibility that Europeans are still having, where the person of the slave is the property of the slave master, right? It's not so much for Africans the person as the labor. And that impacted the way that Africans handled slavery and treated their slaves. Nevertheless, your ownership, the king's ownership of the slave's labor, was transferable. The king could sell it to people if he wanted to. He could, give it as a gift or as a reward for services rendered, things like that. He could give a person the labor of his slaves, and, the slave would go with them and, give their labor to the person the king gave it to. So when Europeans are showing up, they're sort of, coming in, they're, merchants, explorers. They want to, find some profitable activity going on. They want to find some gold, have some stuff they can trade for gold there, but, oh, you've got slaves. Well, well, sure, we'll buy up those too and be very happy to bring gold. A lot of what the Europeans are bringing very often are weapons, iron weapons, steel weapons, gunpowder is a big, very much in demand. And the Europeans are happy to be, handing these weapons over to African kings and chiefs and tribes, because then they can be better able to go fight wars against other Africans next door and go capture more slaves and bring them back. So the Europeans are, trading, guns and weapons and things, masonry and other kinds of finished products, manufactured products, to the Africans in exchange for gold, and also in exchange for, especially more and more, for slaves, and sort of taking them away to plantations, which are not what the Africans sort of, understood slavery was all about, in a sense, or, changing, the conditions and actually something much, much harsher and more dehumanizing compared to what the experience of a slave within an African society would have been. So the lesson of all this, don't exaggerate or distort it in either direction. There is certainly lots of blame to go around. There are no good guys in the slave trade. You do get a lot of Africans who are very happy to be increasing their wealth and power by selling and trading slaves to Europeans. There are Europeans who are happy to be, giving weapons to the Africans so they could get slaves and carry them off into servitude on plantations. Everybody is, involved, so to speak, in, continuing this kind of a process. And the other thing is that European demand for slaves, as you get European expansion of the Americas, all this vast new territory that they want labor forces to get plantations going on, this creates a lot of demand on African societies to increase the supply of slaves available to the Europeans. And what you get is a kind of a vicious circle. Because for the African peoples, you could get a lot more money and a lot more power by coming up with more slaves to give to Europeans. How are you going to get more slaves? You're going to go fight more wars with your neighbors, right, and try to capture slaves away from them. Supposing an African king decides, nope, I don't like the direction this is going in, I don't want to be selling any slaves to Europeans. Well, the problem is these African kingdoms are relatively small. There's a bunch of them strung along the coast. The Europeans will just go to the next kingdom up the coastline, trade guns with them for slaves, and they're going to come attacking you, taking slaves from your people, right? So as an African leader, it's almost impossible to opt out of the slave trade. If you try, you're just going to wind up becoming a victim. The only way to keep your head above water is to try and, keep attacking your enemies more than they attack you, and the whole thing becomes this vicious cycle. For that matter, from the European side, even there, the fact that there's multiple European countries all starting to get involved in the slave trade also makes it difficult for European countries to put an end to trading in slaves as well, because what happens there is that if one European king or, countries decides, well, we're not going to trade slaves anymore, what's going to happen is that your rivals are going to sweep in, scoop up the trade, make a lot more money, and then they're going to have, more money in their coffers to hire soldiers with, which is going to mean that they're going to have an advantage when they go fighting their next war against you back in Europe, right? So not quite as high stakes for the Europeans as it is for the Africans, but still European powers find it very hard to unilaterally back out of the slave trade. That's going to take a long time before anybody finally manages to bring a stop to it. So the overall effect, as you can see in the textbook, the slave trade winds up creating this vicious circle where it just keeps feeding itself, where the slave trade feeds more and more slave trading, which feeds more and more warfare among Africans, which causes more and more people to be taken as slaves, and then it just keeps on, snowballing that way, until it really winds up having a debilitating impact, I think, on a lot of these African kingdoms. Couple of thoughts along that. One thing is that it makes it very difficult for African kingdoms to invest in their own growth and development, right? You wind up with a state of perpetual warfare where nobody is really building up any alternative form of economic growth or any alternative form of political organization. You do get some kingdoms getting bigger, like the Ashanti along the coastline. Normally, originally had very small African kingdoms, eventually get larger ones as some get more successful at slave trading than others are. but still you don't get, too much of a jump in developing more sophisticated forms of political organization or technological development or economic development, because everybody is sort of constantly having their nose to the grindstone in the slave trade, terrified of falling behind in it. And then finally, also for the big kingdoms in the interior of West Africa, you get another major blow gets dealt with them. Remember you have a Muslim coast in northern Africa, places like Morocco and Algeria, and in the later 1500s, I think it's 1594, you get some very powerful, ambitious Muslim rulers in Morocco who decide to try and seize control of the gold trade for themselves, and they manage to actually get an army across the Sahara Desert, which, if you think about it, is an incredible feat to get a functioning military force across the desert and into West Africa. They take the kingdom of Songhai completely by surprise. March into Timbuktu, capture the city, burn it to the ground, basically. And then they find what many conquerors find, especially long-distance conquerors, that it's one thing to conquer a place, but it's a very different thing to rule it, to actually maintain stable rule there. So the Moroccans sort of destroy this political center of African society, but they turn out to be unable to really provide political stability there themselves. You get a lot of local African peoples, local African chieftains and warlords rebelling against their rule. No one leader really emerges out of them. And so what you wind up with by the time you're into the 1600s, 1650s, 1680s, is Western Africa, that used to be the home to just a couple of, large, stable kingdoms, winds up breaking down into almost complete anarchy with lots of small warrior chieftains all fighting against each other. And again, that becomes a major barrier to the development of any kind of long-term, stable social or political order in Western Africa. So sort of a number of tragic things going on there, but helps to explain sort of the role or the way that Africa is finding itself caught between the powers around it. Okay, so anyway, I will stop there. Like I say, a lot of this is in the textbook, but wanted to highlight a few things, and I'll look forward to seeing your comments and questions and discussion of the primary sources on our forums this week. Thanks, everybody.